something?
No, actually, to do one of those, you have to go to a studio, and you can only do it in 30-minute segments. And I can't say anything in 30 minutes, so these are really just so that when people miss class, they can go and catch up on what it was that they missed. Magical realism is what we're looking at. Now, and it's a form of a larger movement called anti-realism. And these are the people who take those ideas of Plato, that everything is an illusion, to about as much of an extreme as you can possibly take. They're in revolt, and they're in revolt against realism and naturalism and logic and reason and all of the structure in society. And it's not surprising that this movement starts as we're moving into World War I. Remember from the Lost Generation how here were people who had all these beliefs and they just got demolished. All of a sudden the modern world has got all of these inventions, all kinds of new ways for people to die. The longer that war went on, the more obvious it was that it was insane. The battles themselves are insane. There's, for 100 yards of ground, 10,000 people get killed, and then 10,000 more get killed giving it back. The horrors of that war were so beyond what people imagined they were going to be that an awful lot of people lost faith in the way the world was. The idea that reason, it was reason that made all these scientific inventions, and what end have they been put to? Basically just destroying human beings. The ideas of progress that were flourishing in the 19th century don't seem to really have led to the great utopia that they were supposed to lead to. And that makes people upset. Once you have a world war, everything gets crazy. All the stuff that you believed in gets called into question. And so much of what the government does seems lunatic, and so much of the way life is seems lunatic, that the whole idea of a crazy way of looking at the world starts to look kind of rational to you. I mean, if reason and rationalism and logic and Aristotle and this is the real world, if all of that has led to mass destruction, then what good is it? How rational and reasonable is it really? How civilized are we if civilization leads to destroying people by the tens of thousands? And of course the artists lead this rebellion. The first group is the Dadaists, and this is around the turn of the century, and they really flowered during World War I. And what they want is absolute freedom of expression. Not just literature, but art as well. And a lot of these movements start out in art and then spread out into literature. If you were going to write a poem, you had to use a certain kind of diction. You had to generally use, even though for 50 years or so, since Whitman, there had been free verse, people were still generally writing in the fixed forms, with a fixed meter and a certain kind of rhyme in the poem. If you were going to write a novel, or if you were going to write a short story, it had to have a beginning and a middle and an end. It had to follow a chronology. It could only have certain kinds of character. Time had to run the way that it does in real life. You had to have a point to what it was that you were doing. Just creating an impression or a feeling wasn't enough. I mean, even the Romantics that had a point to what they were doing. And those were limitations on the artist. There were things that you just couldn't put into a book. There were things you couldn't talk about. The realists start to talk about the seamier side of America, the seamier side of life in general, and the brutality of most existence. But there's still an awful lot of things that they can't talk about. And so what the artist wanted was absolute freedom. That example that's given there is Man Ray's eyeball, and that's Man Ray was one of the earliest filmmakers. He's got a black and white film where things happen that are completely disconnected. They have that dreamlike quality that all anti-realism and eventually magical realism has. A young lady comes in to a dentist chair. And she sits down in the dentist chair and he puts on the little bib and stuff. And then he opens her eye and he takes a straight razor and they go in close on the eye and he slits the eyeball. Vitreous humor pours out of it. Now it wasn't really her eyeball, obviously it was, but people then, remember, film is so new. Nobody really understands how film is made. They don't know that they came in close on the eye, they stopped the camera, the girl got out of the way, they brought an eyeball in from a cow, they took a razor, they turned the camera back on, they slit the eyeball. We would look at it now and it would never occur to us that that was a real event. But film was so new and using it that way was so new, and that was the kind of thing that even now, even though it's in black and white, even though we know all about special effects, it's still hard to look at that movie without being shocked by it. When Man Ray brought it out, audiences were absolutely stunned. And of course, one of the things that stunned them was that after they cut the eyeball, it goes on to a totally different scene. It has nothing to do with that. What's cutting the eyeball all about? It's not about anything. It's about maximizing sensation. It's about shocking the audience out of their normal way of looking at the world. Maybe it's about fear. But it doesn't matter. It doesn't have to have a meaning. That's one of the things that the Dadaist said. All along, everything you wrote had to have some meaning to it, some understandable and describable purpose. And they said that's not the way art really is. Art isn't about ideas. Art is about experience. And when you cut open an eyeball on screen and people take that as if it's real, it shocks them. It changes. Art is supposed to change your life. It's not supposed to necessarily, this is the Dadaist view, not necessarily my view. It isn't supposed to explain things to you. It's supposed to intensify your existence. And when you have something horrible like that, it makes you think. You can't get that image out of your mind. It starts to influence everything that happens to you for at least the next day or so. Well, that's what successful art is supposed to do. Art isn't supposed to, according to the Dadaists, be up there on the wall. See, the traditional idea was that artists somehow experienced the world more intensely than the rest of us. And then they painted or they wrote these experiences down. And they framed them in a book or they framed them in a frame. And the audience comes and reads the artist's experience and the artist's interpretation of the experience, and they get this secondhand, because they're not capable of getting it themselves, experience of the world. The artist puts art out there and you come and react to it. And the Dadaist says, no, that's not what happens. Art isn't presented. Art is experiential. It's a collaboration between the audience and the artist, between the experience he presents and the sensibility that they bring to it anymore. He doesn't tell it. The artist isn't supposed to tell us something or show us something. He's supposed to be able to create an experience which we have and respond to on our own. At least half, if not more than that, of the meaning in a painting should come out of the audience, not out of the artist. Well, that's a radically new way of thinking of things. The idea that the reader should have to participate in the meaning of the story, not simply discover the meaning. In the past, there were stories written that were maybe hard to understand, that were a little bit difficult. But the idea was that the author knew what it was that he was trying to convey, and he put it in the story, and you were supposed to dig it out to the best of your ability. And Dadaism comes along and says, the artist should put in experiences, and you should have them, and you should interpret them. There isn't a truth that he has that he's supposed to be telling you and you're supposed to be finding out. They wanted to get rid of all of these artificial limits. They wanted to be able to use whatever language they wanted to use. They didn't want to have to be bound up by following a chronological order to things. They didn't want to be limited by having to have characters who were only viewed at a particular time in their life in a particular way. Instead, they want to be able to move around. The world doesn't make a lot of sense to them, and it isn't supposed to. They don't like logic very much. Logic had gotten civilization into a lot of trouble. In fact, they weren't real big on civilization at all. So they wanted to suppress logic. I mean, there were all kinds of logical reasons for conducting the war. But when you come down to blowing people apart, there aren't any good logical reasons for that. So logic is the enemy as far as they're concerned, and they try to destroy logical sequence in their work. They actively, it wasn't just that they couldn't organize what they did. They intentionally made it disorganized. Their whole society aimed people towards rational, logical, step-by-step thinking. And the only way to get them out of that was to break all of that down in the art that you presented, to immerse people for some brief period of time in a world in which there isn't structure. There isn't a logical arrangement of ideas, where you have to assign meaning yourself. So they invent things like the montage in film, a series of images overlapping one another. None of them staying there long enough for you to get any real context for it. And the context becomes a succession of images. Or collages. Not painting anymore, and not even necessarily pictures. Scraps of newspaper, splotches of paint, pieces of photographs, cloth, anything the artist could get, put together and arranged, not thrown onto the canvas, arranged in a specific way that was somehow pleasing, but not in any way that you could explain why you like that. If you saw a collage, you couldn't really say, this is what I like about it. You couldn't reason how the parts were logically connected, because they weren't. They were aesthetically connected. The artist put that little piece of red cloth here rather than down here because it feels like that's where it ought to be. But there's no reasonable. He didn't say, well, let's see, there's a mass of color here and a little block of color there, and I need to offset that to create balance in the painting. Instead, he said, this looks good next to the picture from the newspaper. Again, you put things together without an obvious logical arrangement. Symbolist poetry, where images were made, verbal pictures were thrown into the poem, but they didn't lead anywhere. There wasn't any sequence to them. The poem didn't tell a story. It didn't even create a single experience, a single event. Instead, it was these images, just the way you have dreams. You know, the images in your dreams aren't usually logically arranged. You switch from place to place. There's no cause and effect sequence in your dreams. The surrealists take that a little bit further, but the Dadists are the ones who start to try to create a dream-like reality for the person experiencing the art. Special effects like Man Ray, images that were meant simply to stun or shock people or stir up their sensations, and either a complete movement away from the storyline, from the plot, or a plot that was so scrambled that you would have to sit down and really work hard at rearranging the events in the story to come up with any kind of chronological sequence. And in fact, did the Dadists want you to do that? Take their scrambled work and unscramble it and arrange it like it was some kind of puzzle? No, they wanted you to experience it as disjointed as it was presented, to impose your own kind of associations on it, but not to try to arrange it into some kind of logical sequence. The very idea of breaking up the logic was to do just that. Logic and reason don't have any place in art, the Dadaists argued. And in fact, because to them, art was an experience. There was nothing sensible you could say about art. I mean, if you've ever read art criticism, the kind of things that you saw in The Balloon, where people are talking about the balloon, and the critics say things like, critical opinion was divided. Monstrous pourings, that's one quote. Heart. What is that? Certain contrast with darker portions. Inner joy. Large square corners. Conservative eclecticism that has so far governed modern balloon design. Abnormal vigor. Warm, soft, lazy passages. Has unity been sacrificed for a sprawling quality? Kettle catastrophe. Munching. Now those are all the kind of critical comments that you would have found on a story in different newspapers and magazines in the 60s when Bartleby was writing. But you would have found the same kind of criticism at the end of the 19th century. But when somebody tells you that a painting was stirring, or that it was munching, or that it was a catastrophe, and you haven't seen the picture, can you form that picture in your mind? No. You want to experience a picture, how do you have to do it? Yeah, you've got to go and see it. You've got to go sit there, stand there in front of the painting for a while. Nobody can tell you what the painting looks like. You have to see a painting. You have to experience it. Nobody can explain it to you. Somebody paints a big mural, and when you go and look at it, there's a little dog over in the corner. And when you look at it, everything is about that little dog. But when somebody else sees it, there's a skyscraper in it over on the left. And to them, everything is connected to the skyscraper. And where you stand when you see the picture. That's why that pointillism, where they make the little dots, you stand up close to that and you see a lot of pretty dots. But even up close, it's an interesting picture. Then you back away and it starts to take shape, and you back even further away and it becomes like a photograph. So where you stand determines your experience. And whether you knew that, they used to have, they had them in the comics strips in the newspaper for a while. And they used to be in the mall, in those places that sell paintings. You look at them and they just look at like a jumble of lines, and then all of a sudden they coalesce into a picture. I mean, you have to know how to look at them. The trick is to focus here. If the painting is there, the trick is to focus here, and then all of a sudden you can see the painting in the background. They used to hide the newspaper from me because it took me so long. Trying to get this, moving it around. Sometimes moving it around would help, but it would. I don't know what those things were called, but when you looked at them without that focus, it was just a jumble of lines, and then you could see an actual representational picture once you learned how to focus on it. The Dadists didn't have those, but that's the kind of thing that they wanted, except that they didn't necessarily want it to coalesce into a single thing. So where you stand has got an awful lot to do with it. Music. If you read music criticism, could you, from reading a review, tell what the band sounded like? No. What do you have to do if you want to know what the band sounded like? You got to buy the CD, you got to listen to the music, you got to go to the concert. You have to be there and experience the art. Nothing intelligent can be said about music or graphic art. And probably nothing intelligent can be said about literature either. Good thing the Dadists didn't catch on, or I wouldn't be getting paid to do this. The Dadists, that's why the reason they're called the Dadists is they did their art, and then the critics came to them and said, what does it mean? And anybody know what they said to them? Dada. Dada. What does Dada mean? It doesn't mean anything. It's baby talk. It's gibberish. It's saying, that is so stupid a question that the only intelligent response to it is gibberish. What does it mean? It's a stupid question. It means it is. It doesn't mean it is. Go look at it. Whatever happens to you when you look at that piece of art, that's what it means. And when somebody else looks at it, that's what it means. But for me to tell you what it means, if I wanted to tell you what it meant, I'd write a poem. In fact, somebody came to Robert Frost once about the, what was the poem? Two roads converge in the snowy woods. Anyway, they said to him, what does the poem mean? And Frost said, if I wanted to tell you what it meant, I would have written an essay. I wrote a poem. You have to read the poem and interact with it. That's what it means. And the Dadaists didn't even bother with that explanation. Whenever anybody asked them, they said, Dada. It meant gibberish. It means it's a nonsensical answer to a nonsensical question. Art, they believe that art is a lie. The whole idea of art with a set of rules that everybody has to follow is what they meant when they said art is a lie. What they really meant was traditional law. What they probably should have said was criticism is a lie. You have to experience art. You can't explain it. Now gradually the Dadaists give way to the Surrealists. Surreal comes from super real, or the reality above reality. Early on, even the Romantics had looked at the world and said that the world of dreams is the real world. Remember when we look at Plato, it said that. Everything is an illusion. And it's only an arbitrary distinction that makes us believe that the sequential events of the day, or what we think are the sequential events of the day, are what's real, and the non-sequential events of the night are unreal. To the Romantics, when you dreamed, that was when you saw through the illusion to the cosmic world. And the Surrealists say pretty much the same thing. The ultimate reality is dream. This sequential part of life is the illusion. And so they tried to reproduce dreams. They didn't even necessarily want conscious control of what they did. They wrote things down spontaneously. Many of the writers did what was called automatic writing. You just take a pencil and you try to go into a kind of a trance-like state, and your hand will start writing. And you don't think about what it's writing at all. And then they would gather that up and they would rewrite it so people could read it, because it's usually pretty hard to read. And then some of them would cut those papers. They'd type it up, and then they would cut the papers up and reassemble them and shuffle them and present them to the reader that way. Because to the extent that they consciously organized things, they were denying what they believed, which was that the disorganized and seemingly random presentation of events in dreams is what's real. And they wanted their art to reproduce dreams for people. The landscapes in their work were dream landscapes. They shifted and changed all the time. You didn't have a single setting for a story. It varied back and forth. Like the Dadaists, they believe that art can't be explained, that it just happens. Now Picasso says art is a lie that makes men see the truth. Well, all art is a lie because even representational art, even art where you're drawing the picture of a tree and two flowers, or you're drawing a picture of a bowl of fruit. Is it a bowl of fruit? No, it's a representation of a bowl of fruit. It's not a real experience, it's a lie in that respect. When you write a story, is it true? Not even if you're a realist. It's a manipulation of the truth. To some extent, a lie has entered in. Experience is what's true. The representation of experience is by definition a lie. But Picasso says you can tell it's okay to lie. It's all right that a picture of a bowl of fruit isn't a bowl of fruit. As long as when somebody experiences that picture of a bowl of fruit, they see the truth. That picture I mentioned earlier, Guernica, with the distorted bull turning around and screaming in the painting, and it's then there are faces, but they don't actually look like faces. And you know what Picasso's faces look like? Both eyes are on the same side of the head, and there's an ear missing, or there's two ears where there should only be one, and things are the wrong color, and their shape is distorted. When you look at the picture, Guernica, you may not know it's about the bombing of civilians for the first time. You may not know it's about bombing at all. But when you look at that picture, you do get a feeling of horror. Just like, well, now it's been used so much in advertising, it doesn't have much impact. Edward Munch's The Scream. It's like the person's head is twisted like this, and their mouth is open, and their hands are up by their face, and their whole body is twisted. And in fact, the whole painting sort of flows up like a scream. You don't have to know if Munch was ever scared. You don't have to know if there was some event in his life that he's particularly thinking about when he painted that scream. All you have to do is look at that painting. You don't even have to know the title of it is The Scream. You can get that from it. In other words, it's a lie. There's not really somebody there screaming, but it tells you a truth. When somebody screams, it shapes everything around it. That's why that whole painting swirls and vibrates. If somebody, right now, it won't work now because I'm bringing it to your attention. But 5 minutes ago, if somebody had screamed in the middle of class, what would have happened? Would you have ignored it and gone on? No. First of all, everybody's attention goes towards a scream. The fact that somebody screamed, after they screamed, even if they laughed at that and said, oh, I saw a mouse, that's why I screamed, or I just had a horrible thought, there's only one more week until the midterm, and that was why I screamed. Even if we had a rational explanation, and we go back to the rest of the class, will we be free of that scream? No, it'll be there in the back of your minds. To some extent, you'll be waiting for the next scream, or you'll still be thinking about that last one. Or that scream will set you off thinking about screams out of your own life. You may have to go far afield to find them, but everybody's got screams somewhere in their life. And so it would shape everything around it. But Munch doesn't explain that. He doesn't tell us that's what it's all about. He simply presents that event. And the event is a lie because it's artificial, but it makes you see the truth. And they ridicule the whole idea of art criticism and of theories of art. Why are theories of art preposterous? Well, if talking... I'm sorry, Mr. Dunphy.
Well, I was saying, how could you have a theory about someone else's work when you don't know what that person was thinking at the time that they did it?
Yeah, that if viewing a work is an experience, then creating a work is also an experience. And it's not something that's done rationally. I don't think there are very many artists that are sitting there going, yellow and, let's see, what's the opposite of yellow on the color wheel? Blue, okay, I'll put blue there. I mean, if you ever see somebody paint, they get into it. And so theory goes out the window. The whole idea of being able to reduce art, which is an experience, to anything reasonable is preposterous to them. So they wrote manifestos, long political tracts, denouncing manifestos. It was like they would have come up with a bumper sticker that said, wipe out bumper stickers. They're kind of the lunatic fringe of art, but that's where things change, at the fringes, at the edges. You need somebody to take things to extremes to move the establishment even a little ways. And so these people went as far as they could. Let's take a break until 3 o'clock, and then we'll look at magical realism in the stories. These attitudes towards art don't just die out in the 20s. go in and out and come back especially strong in the 60s. You have, for example, Andy Warhol making a silk screen of a cardboard box that Brillo boxes came in to the food store, and putting that in the Museum of Modern Art, and that was considered an act of genius. What was Warhol saying by doing that? Taking something you could have found out behind a cardboard box you could have found behind the food town, and I don't think he silk screened it. I think he went behind food town, he got a box, and he put it on the pedestal at the show.
That art is everywhere?
One thing you may have been saying is art is everywhere. Art is what you see as art. It's not what somebody has the rules for. One of the things that the 60s came up with in literature was a thing called found poetry. Somewhere where somebody had written something that they didn't intend as a poem, but in fact it was. For example, in the 60s, there were vending machines. To get your money back, you had to press this little button. It wasn't electronic. And there was a little phrase that said, "Push hard for coin." Well, there's a poem about America right there. Everything that needs to be said about our whole culture is really in that little thing, "Push hard for coin." So somebody saw that as a basically a little. If you had thought about writing that, you might have written that poem about America. And so the poet becomes somebody who can find poetry in the world, as opposed to somebody who can create poetry. One of the other things Warhol was saying was criticism is preposterous. When Andy Warhol put that Brillo box on the pedestal, he and his friends were standing off to the side, passing a joint around and laughing at the critics who came up and said, "Oh, what a comment on the materialism of our modern society. Well, how brilliant is that?" He said, because he had told them before, no matter what I put up there, they're going to find some interpretation for it. They're going to give it some sort of meaning, so it doesn't matter what's up there. And they'll be doing what we think art is anyway, creating an experience, but they won't know that's what they're doing. Jackson Pollock, dripping the paint on the canvas. That goes back to not having a rational control over what's going on. In other words, what that painting, what that canvas becomes is a piece of the moment. He couldn't reproduce any of those paintings exactly the same, because the moment can't be reproduced. And all the painting is really supposed to present is that experience for you. Not necessarily his, but something that triggers your own. The 60s also invented the happening. Anybody ever hear of a happening? Anybody know what they were? Somebody would have put a poster up that said there was going to be a happening, and everybody would show up. And they would bring things. Not anything anybody told them to bring. For example, sandpaper. And the things would be passed around through the audience. And it was usually random music. There were all different kind of smells that were brought. Sometimes it was incense. Sometimes it was other kinds of other things that had a strong odor to them. A lot of different kind of lighting going on. Sometimes several kinds of music playing at one time. And these objects would be passed around through the audience, not in any order that somebody had set up, but kind of spontaneously. And, well, what happens if you're sitting there in the midst of all this and somebody gives you a piece of sandpaper? What do you do with it? Well, first of all, you probably never thought about sandpaper before, and you probably never really felt sandpaper before. So you see what it feels like. And you realize there are two different kind of grades of sandpaper here, and one's rough and one's not nearly as rough. And then maybe you decided, I wonder how this feels on my tongue. So then you start sandpapering your tongue. Now, I have to admit that most of the people at these places were wrecked, and so almost anything seemed like a good idea to them. Why would art want to assume that its audience had been taking drugs? Why would an artist want to encourage an audience to do that? What do drugs do to your reason, to your logic?
Enhance like the senses, extra senses.
It enhances the senses by obliterating your sense of logic. When you can't really put things together much, drugs scramble your brain. So the part of your brain that's usually dealing with putting things in order and structure has nothing else to do but open itself up to sensation. So it increases sensation. That was one of the assumptions. Now, would that seem like a bad thing to the surrealist or the Dadaist? That the audience is drugged? No. Reason and logic, look what reason and logic have led to. War and destruction. A life that's focused on material objects. Doesn't seem very rewarding for people. Reason hasn't led us to the promised land at all. And so to the surrealist and the Dadaist, anything you do to scramble or get rid of reason is a perfectly good thing. The more you enhance your sensations, the more you're going to be able to perceive the art. So it's not surprising that even as early as the 20s, the drugs and this kind of art pretty much went hand in hand. One of the things about them is drugs will create a dreamlike, non-sequential, non-linear, non-time-bound experience of the world. Now, it does that by scrambling your brain, but the artist doesn't care about stuff like that. The moralist cares. The businessman cares. But the artist doesn't care. The artist cares about enhancing your experience. And to them, drugs, there's nothing inherently bad about drugs at all anyway. I mean, a rationalist will tell you, well, if you keep taking them, you lose enough brain cells that the logical part of your brain stops functioning, and you get trapped in the world of dreams. But what would a surrealist think about living permanently in the world of dreams? Bad thing? No, good thing. Finally got rid of that annoying logic and reason. And now you spend all your time looking at real reality. Can you make any sense out of it? No, but you're not supposed to. To the surrealist and the Dadaist and the anti-realist, the function of life is to experience things anyway, not to put them in little boxes and to impose some sort of an order on them. So it's not surprising that drugs and the mindset of drugs goes hand in hand with this kind of art. I mean, it creates hallucinations are like dreams. They're intense. The sensations are the same almost as reality, but they don't have any logic to them. They don't have any sequence to them. You notice it sounds exactly like the kind of art that the Dadaists and the Surrealists and eventually the magical realists are trying to create. And if art is supposed to break down logic and order and tradition, well, drugs do it an awful lot faster. So it's not surprising that a lot of this was drugged art. Which again, when the critics went to a happening and the bowl of sauerkraut came by and then the sandpaper, what did they do? What do critics usually do? They apply their reason and they try to find out some movement. Well, what did the sauerkraut have to do? Did that have to do with Germany? Is this about the Third Reich? Was the sandpaper, did that have to do with the pain of the Holocaust? Oh, that's what this is all about. They try to create some kind of logical structure. If there was a logical purpose to a happening at all, it was simply this: enhance your senses. All through the 50s, and probably to a good portion of the 40s, America had been moving away from sensation. It had been moved more and more into regularity and conformity and organization and rules, and further away from emotion and from sensation. So all the happenings we're supposed to do is to loosen up people's emotions. You wouldn't normally go down to wherever you keep your tools and get out a piece of sandpaper and feel it. But in that context, when somebody gave it to you, that would be a natural thing to do. Or maybe you might look at it. If you looked at it in a certain light, you could see the little grains, the little pieces of glass or whatever it is that's on sandpaper. It's not actually sand. You would respond to it with your senses. And that's what a happening was all about. It didn't have any purpose other than expanding people's sensations and their awareness of physical sensations. So when we look at magical realism, it's just an extension of that. The artist is trying to do with words what those physical artists were trying to do with their pictures and what they were trying to do with movies and what they're trying to do with things like happenings. They're trying to create this surreal world, this world of dreams. After the realists, there was a group that we didn't get to look at called the Impressionists. And the Impressionists said, the realists are crazy. You can't stand and look at the world objectively and take in facts. Everything you do is colored by your emotional state at the time. And nobody can suspend their emotional state. There are undercurrents of emotion going on all the time. You get up in the morning and the first thing that happens is you stub your toe. What's the rest of the day like? Usually pretty bad. Not because there are necessarily more bad events happening that day, but simply because you're attuned to them. You stubbed your foot and you're expecting bad things to happen, and so whenever one pops up, it's like yellow cars. You will see lots of yellow cars on your way home today. Not because there are more yellow cars out there, but simply because now you're going to be aware of the yellow cars. So it's the same thing with the negative events. A negative event happens first thing in the morning. It sharpens your awareness of negative events for the rest of the day. So you're a realist, you stub your toe, you go out to observe humanity and make scientific judgments. The stuff that you're going to notice is the negative stuff. You wake up in the morning, you wake up a little bit early before the alarm goes off, you got plenty of time and you get lucky. Is that going to change your attitude for the day? Change mine. Everything, you're going to be looking for the good things now the rest of the day. You had a happy experience in the morning, you can expect happy experiences to follow through the day. Not because there's more of them, but because you're going to be aware of them. So the impression it says, you're always in some sort of an emotional state. More or less intense, but never a completely unemotional state. So all the artist can really describe is what's going on inside them while an event was going on. And so what the Impressionist does is give you the sensations of somebody having an experience. That's what the magical realists do. They try to give you what's going on inside. How many of you found those 3 stories easy to read? How many of you instantly knew what they were all about? But you know what they're all about now, right? They're all about exactly what they were. They're not really about anything. They were simply the recreation of, in 2 of the cases, the balloon and Pansalopia. Both of those are the recreation of a subconscious experience. The world of dreams in Pansalopia and the real world, the world of events, mixed together. You can't tell them apart. Just the way in your mind, time and space also blur together. Even while you're sitting here listening to this lecture, you're not here most of the time. Whenever something gets mentioned, it triggers some sort of a memory in your mind. And for a moment, you have a reverie. You go back to that incident for a few seconds. And then you're back to paying attention or whatever. And then another thought triggers you in another direction. So even what we think of as time, what's ongoing now, is continually interrupted by the intrusion of events that have happened before, sometime in the past, or by events that never happened. Notice that in Pansalopia, what's the most striking thing in there that you wouldn't find in the real world? The guard, he's a lion. He's a lion man. But you notice that doesn't really leap out in that story. Just the way if a lion who talked and walked like a man appeared in your dream. You wouldn't stop the dream and go, oh, that's too weird. That doesn't happen in real life. I'd get that out of my dream. You would just go on with the dream as if it were reasonable for it to be there. Time mixes up. And we look at Pantalappi, you'll see that you could take that story and arrange it as a chronological series of events, but that's not the way it's presented. Linear time, past, present, future, doesn't exist. And it doesn't exist in the subconscious. For the subconscious, which is basically the right side of the brain, there is only one time. Now. Whatever's going on in the brain at this instant is what's real. You can't tell fantasy from reality. And so basically what the magical realist does is shift this over into that side of the brain. Create a work which is in itself an unconscious or a subconscious experience. In all three of those stories, the improbable premise is treated as if it were true. In the balloon, what's happening in the balloon? Well, what is the balloon? Is it Jules Verne's balloon? He's going up in it, sail across the country? It just appears over the city. And we get a whole lot of detail. Now, once he says that the balloon appeared, he then treats it as if it's a real balloon. And we would get a realistic description of the balloon, what color it was, how the engineers work on it, how they fill the thing up, how it interacts with the landscape. It's treated as if it is an actual real balloon. But it's really only a symbolic balloon, but it doesn't matter. Once the writer establishes the premise that a Viking is sent to the end of the world to find the truth, after that, everything is treated as if that were true. Was there ever a machine that wrote the name of the person's crime on their back? No. I'm sure that thing never existed. It feels like it existed, but it didn't. Kafka made that up. But you notice once he tells you there's such a machine, and he treats it as if there really is a penal colony on an island that has a machine like that, from then on, it becomes reality. And he gives us all the details of the machine. You could probably build that machine from the description that he gives us. That's why he spends so much time on it. One of the things that the magical realist does is that you get a sharply etched realism in presenting ordinary events. And that creates for you the feeling that this is real. The way the explorer is standing around, and first of all, he describes a place where the execution takes place. And he describes all of the machine and all of the gears, and the officer explains to him everything about how it works. And that's so realistic, you really think there could be a machine like that. You could form that mental picture. The idea that there was a society that wanted to write people's crimes on their backs, that's fantasy. But because they've set up the reality so intensely, when it slides over into fantasy, we don't really notice. The same way with Bartlemy's story. Once he starts talking about that balloon as a balloon, you really start to get a realistic picture of it. It's the way if somebody really did inflate a balloon over New York City, almost everything he says about it would be the way it would actually look. It would sag down in places. It would butt up against the building. How about the way people respond to it? If a balloon suddenly appeared covering at a, down low in between the buildings and up above the buildings, if that did appear in New York City, how would people respond? All the same way? How do people respond to it in the story? They all like it? They all hate it? There's some from each side. Some people are frightened of it. Some people like it. Some people go on as if it's just part of the landscape. They have what we'd expect from New Yorkers. Oh yeah, it's a balloon. and they go on with whatever it is they're doing. The little kids jump off the building onto it. Is that what little kids would do? Yeah, I think so. And you can walk on it. Nice sloping, gentle slopes. You can even travel around the city walking on the balloon. If such a balloon really were constructed and blown up and put in the middle of New York City, that's just what people would do. If it couldn't be taken down, at first they might want it taken down to get back to their normal lives, but after a while, they would do just what the people in the story do. They adjust to it. They even start to like it. It becomes natural after a while. And he's able to create that because he does such a vivid, realistic description of it. And yet, there is no such balloon. Absence of customary forms. Pansalopia, what's the plot like? It's all over the place. I mean, basically, the shaman comes to the warrior, tells him he has to sail to the end of the world to find the truth. They get in the boat, they sail there. They get there, they meet the lion guard. The lion guard lets them in, and they meet Vashmina. She dances for them. The Viking makes love to her, or her image. Again, reality gets distorted. I mean, you can have sex with a mirror in your dream, but you can't do it in real life. So even time and space get distorted. They realize that she's casting a spell on them. They kill the guard on the way out. They get in the boat. They sail away. Vashmina starts to dance. She casts a spell on them. They can't see the sky anymore. Ardnith realizes they've been cursed. The storm comes up. Vashmina's still dancing. She dances up the storm. She's a sorceress, apparently. The ship sinks. Vashmina gives birth, and everything coalesces. As he's drowning, his whole life flashes before his eyes. The caribou hunting with his father, his wife's braid. And it all comes together at the end of the story. All time generates from the dream. It all comes back to the dream. Outside of this world, everything coalesces and makes sense. But I mean, there is a chronological sequence of events, but that's not the way it's presented. It's scattered around. We move around in time just the way a dream moves in time. There's never more than one incident, or two at the most, that occur chronologically in that story, without being interrupted by something out of, in other words, if we take the event, let's say it's the drowning. The next event will not be about the drowning. It'll be about Ardith before he went and how his wife didn't want him to go. Or it'll be about when he meets Vashmina. Or it'll be about Vashmina having the baby. Or it'll be something other than the drowning itself. The events are always scrambled, and it's the way the mind works. It moves around without the limitations of time, without the limitations of space, without logical sequential arrangement the way we expect them to be. In other words, it's just the way the mind works. Just the way dreams work. Even the characterizations. If we look in the penal colony, the prisoner, does he act the way you expect a prisoner to act? No, he's kind of like a talking dog. He has no clue what's going on. They're discussing the thing that's going to kill him. He doesn't know he's going to be killed. He doesn't even know he's been sentenced. They're talking in French. He doesn't understand it. But he's still fascinated by it. And the soldier, what's the soldier like? Does he do much thinking? No, he's kind of bewildered too. He doesn't know. I mean, he knows he's got a job. He's supposed to keep the prisoner. But he nods off. The prisoner gets too close to the machine and has to pull him away. He does cut the clothes off the prisoner and put him on the bed of the harrow. But when the officer lets him go, does he still treat him like a prisoner? No, they start cavorting and laughing about the guy's clothes being torn up. And when the explorer leaves and goes back to town, actually even before that, what happens to the officer in the end of the story?
He gets put on the machine himself.
Puts himself on the machine. Why?
Maybe the explorer convinced him that it wasn't just like.
That it was that the explorer isn't going to support him. His whole way of life and everything he believes in is over. So, if you believe in a set of ideas and you lived by them, and they're gone, you ought to commit suicide. And what's the most poetic way to do it? Put yourself on the machine. What's the inscription that's being written on him, or was supposed to be written on him? Be just. Be just. That was his job. That was his responsibility, to be just. Well, it's not his fault there's a new commandant. It's not his fault that they can't get the replacement parts for the machine. It's not his fault that his whole society has changed. But he believes that he was being just before. He can't be just now. So he's committing a crime. Well, if you commit a crime, what should happen to you by his way of thinking?
You should be executed.
You should be executed for it. You failed in your duty. This is a penal colony. They're all prisoners, but it's also very military. Well, what happens in the military when you don't do your duty? It's wartime, they shoot you. He hasn't been able to do his duty, so it makes perfect sense to him to put himself on the bed. Up until that point, it looks almost reasonable, if suicide can ever look reasonable. But what happens to him when he's on the bed, when he's in the machine? Does it right be just on his back? No, the machine starts to fall apart. And instead of writing, the spikes just impale him. And when he goes to look at him, he's stuck. After it doesn't even finish writing, be just, all over his body. How long is that supposed to take? 12 hours. 6 hours, you realize what it's writing. Then you have 6 more hours to deal with the nature of your crime. But he doesn't get the 6 hours. He doesn't get the epiphany. It's absurd. It's ridiculous. What he expected to get, the enlightenment, everything he believed in, gets reduced to absurdity. Because it just impales him. And it just tears him apart. And then when it tries to dump him, he's stuck on the spikes. And the explorer and the soldier and the prisoner have to try and get him off them. Now remember before when the officer is talking about how the machine used to work and how everybody came and everybody fought to be able to look into the prisoner's eyes at the 6th hour. Why?
Because he would be enlightened.
That's when they would see that flash of enlightenment in his face. And everybody wanted to see that. You notice he's got little children. Most of the time he says because he officiated at it, he was always there to look into the prisoner's eyes and usually had a little child in each arm to show them. More than most of the other stories, in the penal colony is an irrational look at the irrationality of the world. What's the difference between putting somebody on a machine that writes the name of their crime on their back and strapping them down, strapping them into a wooden chair and shaving their head, in fact shaving their whole body, and strapping them down and putting a metal cap on their head, conducting a ceremony? I mean, when they execute somebody, do they just run them in there secretly, kill them, and that's it? No, there are witnesses, there are things that have to be read, there are things that have to be said. And then you run a certain number of volts of electricity through him and fry his brain. Is that a reasonable, logical, rational thing to do? It's no more crazy than writing a crime on his back. You can see this story as an allegory about capital punishment. What's Kafka's attitude towards capital punishment if we have to just take this story? Hey, he's not in favor of it. It's unreasonable. It's irrational. What we think is going to change other people's attitude towards committing crimes. I'm not necessarily against the death penalty. But does it deter crime? No. Most of the time when somebody kills somebody else, is it a long, planned out thing? Most murders. No. They're not done for money. They're not done for profit. They're not planned out logically in advance. Most of the time somebody loses their temper, usually when they're drunk, picks up whatever's handy and kills somebody they know. The vast majority of murders are committed by people who knew the person they were murdering. We all run around terrified of these strangers who are going to come and kill us. It's your friends and your family who's most likely to kill you statistically. And nobody who's about to kill somebody goes, oh, wait a minute, they have the death penalty in this state. I guess I won't do it. In other words, it doesn't promote justice any more than the machine does in Kafka's story. When you get to the end of the story, it hasn't written a message. Justice, by the officer's way of defining it, hasn't been done. It hasn't been done to him. And it never really could be done. Well, why didn't Kafka just write a realistic story about somebody being electrocuted? Would it have worked as well? Probably not. As soon as you start talking about electrocution and a form of capital punishment that you're familiar with, you probably, how many of you have an opinion of one kind or another on capital punishment? Yeah, most people have one way or another. So in other words, as soon as you start to present a realistic description of an execution, your attitude, pro or con, kicks in. But if you set it in this world that doesn't exist, if you put it in a country that probably, not only in another country, but in another time, because it doesn't seem to be present day, it doesn't even seem to be 1920 in that story. It feels more somehow like the 19th century. People can then look objectively at the event without having those ideas that they're predisposed to. In other words, one of the things that anti-realism was used for, and I would argue that Kafka isn't as much of an anti-realist or as much as a magical realist as Jeff Ford or Bartleby is, it's because he's using this really to make an intellectual point. What should he be doing if he were a true magical realist? He should just be presenting an experience. An experience that goes beyond this world. Instead, he takes another worldly setting, and he seems to be making a point, although maybe he isn't. I mean, look how the story doesn't end. In other words, if Kafka were writing about capital punishment, and just about capital punishment, and was really trying to make you anti-capital punishment, where would the best place for the story to end have been? When they try to get the body off the spikes and the big spike is stuck in his head. And we realize that the justice didn't work. There wasn't any justice in this. But the story doesn't end there. It goes on. There's a kind of, I mean, that's the most effective point in the story. And yet the story has another several pages. What happens in those last couple pages? The explorer goes into town, and they take him to the commandant's grave, which is in this tea house Now we're getting back to bizarreness again. But he gives us a reasonable explanation for it. Why is the commandant buried there? Why isn't he buried in the cemetery? They think all the followers secreted his body away. Of course, the church wouldn't let him be buried in holy ground. And so they buried him. I mean, this is kind of preposterous. It's like they took Stalin's body, and instead of putting it in state, because he went out of power, they buried it at McDonald's under one of the tables. It's preposterous on the face of it. On the other hand, one of the things that the magical realist does is to tell you the world is preposterous. I mean, there are people who in their time were thought to be great leaders, whose eventual resting place is probably as bizarre as that. What about that idea that he's coming back? And he's going to come and he's going to lead his followers out of that very tea house to recapture things. Was that convincing to you? Did you think that was going to happen? No, it's pretty preposterous. Is there anything like it in the real world? There's all kinds of prophecies that people are going to return from the dead. King Arthur is coming back. Nobody knows where he's buried, but when England is troubled, King Arthur is coming back to save it. The whole idea of somebody coming from the dead and reestablishing their movement, or of a movement generating out of a place that was important historically. Those kind of things abound. And they're ridiculous. In other words, he takes a preposterous thing in the story to show us the preposterousness of real life. When you start to attack the magical realist by saying, well, your stories are unreasonable and the things that go on in them are insane and don't make any sense, he says, look around you. The world is filled with stuff that doesn't make any sense. What sense does it make to retire at 65? You know how good you are at having fun at 65? You got all the really great equipment still? No. You should retire at 16. And you should retire until you're about 25, 28 or so. Because when it comes to having fun, that's when you got all the energy. That's when you got the all of the physical abilities. That's when you have all the opportunities. And instead, we keep making people go to work so that they can. There's something. Work 40 years so you can stop working. Can we just like cut out the middleman? Stop working now? What happens after you get to be about 25 or so, you start to run down and you get partied out and you decide you want to do something in the world. And then going to work makes a lot of sense. You actually would like going to work, so maybe you could find a job that you wanted to do. And then you could, what happens to people when they retire at 65? A lot of them. They go on and live completely fulfilling lives? No, a lot of them die within a year or two. Because they had gotten so used to doing that job and it was so much a part of their life. So they want to keep working. So what do? We make them stop working. There's people like me who want to stop working, and we make them keep working. The whole world is filled with irrationality. So the magical realist would say, you think these stories are crazy? Take a real good look at life. Life is crazier than anything I've written. And Kafka is doing the same thing. Taking the children down so they can look in the face of the man when he realizes what his crime is. When they had hangings, 16, 17, 18, even some part of the 1900s, they were public. People went to see them, just like they came to see this execution. What about the children? They came too. People brought their children to the public hangings. They brought picnic lunches to public hangings. This sounds like a crazy place. Kafka's saying, it wasn't that long ago, before this was the norm, in civilized England, they hung people in public, and children came and watched the executions, and they did it in France, and they did it in Germany, and they did it all throughout the Europe that thinks it's so civilized. If it seems crazy to you in this story, then Kafka's saying, well, you got to look around at the world. The world is what's crazy. Nothing in that story is at all preposterous. The officer who wants to keep this torture machine running wants to enlist the aid of the explorer. He's got this elaborate plan. The commandant is looking for a way to get rid of this thing. They're going to ask you your opinion. Don't give it to anybody. Wait until this meeting. And then when the meeting comes, then stand up and tell the truth about what you think. Now, what does the explorer think about this thing right from the beginning? Do you think the machine's a good idea? No, he thinks it's horrible. He's trying to think of some way to stop it himself. Then the officer tells him the machine's on its way out. You don't even have to do much to get rid of it. But does the officer see that that's what the explorer is going to do? Does he see that the explorer despises the machine, or does he think the explorer admires the machine just the way he does? He thinks that the explorer admires it. He's stunned when the explorer says, no, I won't stand up for your machine at this place. In fact, I've been thinking all along, how can I get this stopped? I think it's an abomination. And the officer's open-mouthed. He's so convinced himself. He's such a true believer. He can't imagine that anybody could believe differently. Is that a fantasy? Are there people like that in the world? Sure, tons of them. We probably bump into one today. So ridiculous as he seems in the book, he's completely out of touch with what's going on around him. He can't read the explorer at all, because the explorer obviously from the beginning has distaste for this. All he sees is it as little distraction. I mean, the prisoner comes up and starts looking through the window at the needles. And the explorer is horrified by it. And the officer notices and has the soldier pull him away. And he says, well, the explorer is getting distracted by the victim. And he wants him to get focused back in the machine. He doesn't see that the explorer is horrified. He has no real contact. And so he looks kind of preposterous, but he's just like people that you find everywhere in the world. Once they have a belief, they think everybody has that belief. And they can't imagine how when the Third Reich fell, did all the Nazis say, oh, we were really wrong. What a bunch of bad ideas. Good thing they got power out of our hands. Let's forget about this and join a new movement. No. They went to Argentina. They went to a whole lot of different places in the world, and they didn't stop being Nazis, and they're still there, and they're still waiting for the Fourth Reich to rise. Just like the guy in the story. So although he seems crazy to us, how could he torture somebody to death like that and have absolutely no feeling about it? Are there people like that in the real world? Sure there are. The guy who throws the switch will tell you, listen, I'm getting paid $200 to do this. It's a lot of overtime. It's a job. Somebody's going to throw it. And not letting him go if I don't throw it. I might as well. He doesn't go home and commit suicide after the execution. He's probably performed a number of them. And he doesn't feel bad about them any more than the officer feels bad about the executions. So again, we have Kafka creating a place that doesn't exist, a bizarre fantasy kind of world, as a way of looking at the irrationality of our world, our civilization. The blurring of distinctions between literary forms. The balloon is actually a poem. It uses the techniques of poetry. The balloon is the central image. The balloon is a metaphor. A metaphor is a comparison between an idea and an object. The balloon is a metaphor for, and this is one of the things, now this is relatively early magical realism. And it explains what it is that it's doing. When you get to the end of the story, just like in a normal story, he tells you what it was all about. The balloon wasn't actual, the balloon was a metaphor. I met you under the balloon on the occasion of your return from Norway. You asked if it was mine. I said it was. The balloon, I said, is a spontaneous autobiographical disclosure having to do with the unease I felt at your absence and with sexual deprivation. So the balloon is a metaphor for this guy's feelings when his girlfriend went away to Norway. And, well, how did he feel when she went away? Did he not think about it while she was gone? He felt lonely. He felt her everywhere he went. If you're in love with somebody and you don't see them for a couple weeks, you forget about them the whole time they're gone and they come back and then it starts right up where it left off? No, you're in love with somebody, you think about them all the time. Their absence, wherever you go, is as palpable as that balloon that covers the city. And in fact, when we look at where the balloon is, there's probably a significance in their relationship for everything he tells us about the balloon. For example, people began in a curious way to locate themselves in relation to aspects of the balloon. I'll be at that place where it dips down into 47th Street, almost to the sidewalk near the Alamo Chili House. What do you want to bet their first date they went to the Alamo Chili House? Well, if you had your first date at the Alamo Chili House and there's something where you're going to meet in that part of the city, what are you going to use as a landmark? The Alamo Chili House. It's a personal landmark for them. And pretty soon, the balloon is like their relationship and like her absence. And it fills up the city everywhere he goes. And he orients himself by it. Wherever he goes, there's something related to her. Why don't we go stand on top and take the air? Maybe walk out a bit where it forms a tight, curving line with the facade of the Gallery of Modern Art. Probably after the Chili House or before the Chili House, they went to the museum together. They went to the Museum of Modern Art together. So that becomes a landmark in their life. The whole thing is a metaphor for the relationship and what he feels about her. First of all, he feels the presence of their relationship everywhere he goes, just like the balloon. He's always responding to the metaphoric balloon, her absence. Do other people notice that? Yeah, well, your girlfriend leaves town. Do you have to tell everybody she's gone? No, they notice the way you're acting. I mean, you might try to focus on your life and pretend like it doesn't matter to you at all, but it's not something you can get away from. So people start reacting to his reaction just the way people are reacting to the balloon. Some of them find it kind of frightening that he could be so obsessed with somebody being gone. And others think it's kind of cute, like the children jumping off onto the balloon. And some get a warm, mentions the warm, lazy passages. Some people get a comforting feeling. Oh, he misses his girlfriend, isn't that sweet? They feel good about it because they miss somebody or somebody misses them. So the metaphor of the balloons really starts to spread out over everybody's life. And everybody starts to react to it. Missing her isn't entirely terrible all the time. You notice that the balloon isn't ugly. The balloon has got all these nice colors, and they kind of blend together. Self-pity is a real attractive emotion. It's more addictive than any drug there is. And why is that? Because it feels good to feel sorry for yourself. up to a point. Once you start looking around for some pills to take a whole bottle of, then of course it's pretty bad. But there's a kind of bittersweet quality to missing somebody that he sort of half enjoys. I mean, he'd really rather she was back. But the fact, he's amazed at this balloon. He's amazed at his own feelings. This is a guy who's apparently never really been in love with somebody before. So the fact that she's gone, he never thought that it would permeate his whole life, that she's not there. And why would that make him feel good? Because it's an intensity of emotion that he didn't think himself capable of. He's a New Yorker. Well, what do New Yorkers usually think of themselves as? Intellectual sophisticates or sentimental, emotional people. How long's the New York minute? It's less than 60 seconds. New Yorkers are supposed to be cynical and impervious, and everything is a scam, and they know what the scam is. They know how it works. Generally, the stereotype of New Yorker is that they're intellectual. And this story appeared in the New Yorker. And the New Yorker's readership in the 60s saw themselves as intellectuals. And how intense are the feelings of people who think of themselves as intellectuals generally? Not very intense. When you're a person who lives in the mind, you pride yourself on thinking about things. Well, intellect goes up, what happens to the emotions? They go down. So you don't have a lot of intense emotions. So this is a sophisticated guy, lives in New York City, kind of an intellectual, has never had a grand passion, doesn't even know he's capable of it, and realizes when his girlfriend goes away that he really loves her. He really misses her. He can't believe that. So there's kind of a bittersweet quality to this balloon. The colors are muted. When he looks at things, they don't light up the way they do when the person that he loves is around. And so the pleasure that comes in this story, part of it is this discovery of a whole dimension to himself he didn't really know he had. You notice it's a spontaneous autobiographical disclosure. This is a thing about Bartlemy's life. It's an autobiographical disclosure, having to do with the unease I felt and with sexual deprivation. What's that about?
She wasn't getting laid.
He wasn't getting laid. In the past, now, do you think that that was a regular thing? He had this intellectuals, enormously active, passionate sex life? Is that what they're focused on? No. I mean, most of the rest of us go to the art museum in hopes that we'll get lucky later on. These are people who go to the art museum to be in the art museum, and they don't even care if there's anything after it. So the fact that he feels deprived is another discovery for him. Remember, this is a guy for whom passion isn't something that he expects to have. I'm not saying intellectuals don't have sex or they don't enjoy sex, but it's not, if it started to dominate their life, if the emotion and sensation started to dominate their life, they'd be real worried about that. They wouldn't expect that to happen. We get together, that's nice. We don't get together, well, that's to be expected. It's that cynical approach you'd expect from New Yorkers. So he's kind of surprised at how much he misses her physically. And so that hangs down everywhere as well, like the balloon. Everywhere he goes, he runs into it. And of course, you notice he comes closest to the buildings, more than likely, in the places that they've been. So he treats this like a poem. It's really an extended metaphor. He's also making comments on society at the same time, and making comments on art, just like the Surrealists did art that commented on theories of art. He's really doing the same thing. A whole lot of that little story is about people's response to the balloon. And the balloon the story itself is the balloon. he's presented this story, just the way he would have put up a balloon, to tell us about this feeling that he had and this set of discoveries that he had. And the critics are going to respond to that. And he gives us all of those little quotes. Well, when a movie came out, especially in the 60s, there would be an ad in the paper for it with a whole lot of little quotes, sometimes only one word long, often taken completely out of context to promote the movie. He's done the same thing. He's making fun of that whole idea of criticism. Also, he says, the apparent purposelessness of the balloon was vexing. It upset people that this didn't have a purpose. As was the fact that it was there at all. Had we painted in great letters, laboratory tests prove, or 18% more effective, this difficulty would have been circumvented. But I could not bear to do so. If we had put a product name up on the side of the balloon, if I had painted the Adidas swoosh on the side of the balloon, everybody would have been okay with it. Why? Because it's art in the service of commerce. It has a purpose now. When there's a balloon there and you don't know how it got there and it won't go away and you don't know what it's for, some people find that real upsetting. But if they've got an explanation for it, oh, it was a publicity stunt, then they'll accept it. People won't even want the balloon taken down necessarily. They may begin to enjoy it. Sometimes a billboard goes up that people find attractive in itself, and they like the billboard. But if you just put the picture there without anything to say why it was there, other people would be disturbed. So he's commenting on the materialism of late 60s American culture, saying as long as it's got a commercial purpose to it, we'll accept it. But if it hasn't got a commercial purpose to it, if its purpose is artistic, if its purpose is experiential, then everybody's going to, or some people at least, are going to be upset about it. So part of the poem is criticizing, is showing the irrationality of criticism. Part of it is making a comment on the commercialization of art. How we can't accept art unless it's got some kind of commercial backing to it. No matter how great a novel is, if you hand write 1,000 copies and start to sell them on the subway, nobody will pay any attention to it. But if you get a big publisher to publish 1,000 copies of it and put them in the mall, everybody will go and read it. Commercial aspect, we have to have commerce define it for us. Also, not only does he make this metaphor, but even after he's told us that it's a metaphor, he goes back to treating it as if it's real. After he tells us it's an autobiographical disclosure. But now that your visit to Bergen has been terminated, it is no longer necessary or appropriate. Removal of the balloon was easy. Trailer trucks carried away the depleted fabric, which is now stored in West Virginia, awaiting some other time of unhappiness, sometimes perhaps when we are angry with one another. Their first big fight. When their first big fight happens, maybe they don't see each other for a while, the fight will be everywhere. Just like her absence was going to be everywhere. But, you know, there isn't a balloon. He tells us this was an imaginary balloon meant to represent my feelings, and then tells you where they stored the balloon. Anytime the surrealist slips back into the world of logic and reason, they're going to go right back out of it again. Because the whole idea is to keep you away from logic and reason. Part of me would have liked it if you could have looked at the balloon and figured it out on your own. But it's the 60s. People weren't nearly as used to doing that. So he has to spell it out a little bit more for us. Does, in Professor Ford's story, does he spell it all out for us? Nope, he creates that unconscious experience. We don't even know where this story takes place. I don't just mean we don't know physically where Pansalopia is. We don't know whether any of these events are actually happening. Are they on the ocean? Or is the ocean only in the mind of Vashmina? Is Vashmina only in the mind of Ardith? Are both of them only in the mind of the shaman? We don't know. He doesn't tell us. The dislocations of time and space. Kafka dislocates time a little bit by putting things back into the 19th century, but once we start, it goes pretty chronologically. We get shown the machine, they put the prisoner in it, the explorer refuses to help the officer gets in it himself, he's killed by the machine, the explorer goes and looks at the grave, the whole place seems so loony to him, he can't wait to get away from it, and he goes onto the ship. Why do the prisoner and the soldier try to follow him? If you fed 2 stray dogs, what would happen?
Come back.
They'd come back. That's what these guys are like. They're kind of like stray dogs. They got no clue as to what's going on. And the explorer somehow, miraculously, got the officer to kill himself. Well, the prisoner thinks he's got some kind of godlike powers. He wants to be around him. The soldier hasn't got anybody to tell him what to do. Are there people like that who need somebody to tell them what to do? Absolutely. And they'll pursue, once somebody comes along to take the place of whoever is suddenly absent in terms of telling them what to do, they'll follow him anywhere. And so at the end of the story, they're trying to go with him. Why doesn't he let them come along? Would you want a following of 2 idiots? No, nobody would. He doesn't want anything to do with that place anymore. It's been a crazy place. He's trying to get away from it. He wants to get back to reason. Of course, Kafka's telling you, you're just like that explorer. Kafka, well, who is Kafka like in this story? He's like the officer. The officer explains everything about the machine. He explains why it was set up. He explains the culture that it came from. Well, the officer is doing it, but Kafka is moving the officer. Kafka's explaining all this to us. We're like the explorer. We're having it explained to us, and we're horrified by it. And when we get to the end of the story, we want to get away from it. We want to get back on our ship and sail out of there. At least if we were readers when Kafka was writing. Now we might want to stay with that story and dwell on it a little bit more. But he was bringing into question ideas that nobody else was even talking about. The reader only puts up with them because he locates them in another time, in another place, and makes it seem like a fantasy. But the basic ideas he talks about were contemporary ideas, but they weren't ideas anybody really wanted to deal with. You go to a party and bring up capital punishment, does everybody flock to you?
No, they flock away from you.
They flock away from you. That's generally the problem with being an artist. You bring up ideas, you create experiences people don't necessarily want to have. And you put them in them. And like the explorer, they want to get back to their ship. So Kafka's, you got a story within a story within a story. Beside being about capital punishment, if it's about that, it's also about art. There's an art to that machine. There's a craft to it that puts it together. There's a theory of art behind it. There's a theory of justice that says you need to have your crime exposed to you slowly in order for it to make any sense to you. That's as irrational as the theories of art. So like any magical realism story, you have a whole bunch of stories put together in one. When we look at Pansalapia, what keeps this from being an ordinary fantasy story, like you might find in realms of fantasy or fantasy and science fiction? There's a warrior in it. There's a Viking warrior in it. There's a sorceress in it. There's a shaman in it. I guess none of you ever read those magazines. Most fantasy stories go chronologically. They go step by step. They take the supernatural world for granted. They take the idea of magic for granted. They take the idea of there being magical beings for granted. That's accepted. Nobody has to prove that in the story. And they go about in a straight chronological fashion, getting a character into some difficulty and getting them out. Is that what this story does? No, this story scrambles reality for us. It raises some significant questions. One, what is the nature of time? We got clocks that measure time with continuing regularity. 3 hours. Do all 3-hour blocks pass experientially in the same uniform way the clock time does? Mr. Dunphy.
Well, I was thinking about this before when we were talking about the whole thing with dreams and how dreams don't follow a certain set path. The only real time is now time. And it's almost the same way if you took every single clock in the world and just got rid of it. It's sort of the same way in real life because if you don't have the way of telling time, sometimes when you're really enjoying yourself, 3 hours feels like 10 minutes. And when you're really bored out of your mind, 3 hours feels like 10 hours.
Yeah, if you're on the bed of Kafka's machine, 6 hours is a long time. On the other hand, if you're having fun, 3 hours goes by fast, depending on what's going on. Experientially, time does not flow uniformly. Well, who's to say clock time is right? What if experiential time is right? In other words, everybody experiences time at their own rate. For some people, it's going incredibly slow at the moment. And for some people, it's just going pretty slow at the moment. And for nobody in here, is time flying by. So we're all perceiving it differently. When we look up there, that number changes at the same time for all of us. But the duration between one click of that clock and the other, experientially, is different for everybody. In a way that what Professor Ford is pointing out here is the whole irrationality of the concept of time. Everything is simultaneous anyway. When your mind wanders and you have a memory, an intense memory that occurs for you at the moment of something that happened to you, say, from your childhood. While that's going on, are you saying to yourself the whole time, this is a memory? No, you're experiencing it. So at the moment, what is the difference between traveling in time and experiencing two different time periods simultaneously? In other words, if you got in a time machine and went back to when you were 6, you would experience that event. Well, how is that significantly different from experiencing that event without a time machine? In other words, if you relive a moment from your past with the same intensity with which it occurred the first time, in practical terms, you've traveled in time. If you could travel in time, you couldn't change anything. Why not? Could you go back in time and die in your own past? No. Could you go back and shoot yourself? Could you go back to your childhood, go back to your teenage self and shoot them? Could that happen? No, because you would have never grown to this point where you got in the time machine to went back and shoot them in the first place. So probably we can't change timelines. Well, if we can't change timelines, then there's no practical difference between traveling back experientially and traveling back physically. Mr. Dunphy?
I was just going to say that's only if time moves in a straight line. If it's a big jumbled mess that who the hell knows.
If time branches, and if it has an infinite number of branches, if we're only aware of one sequence of occurring events, then yeah, then you could go back and change time. But actually you wouldn't change time. All you could do is go back and put yourself in another timeline. You drive your car home and you lose control of it. At that moment, you can get control back and nothing happens. You can continue to lose control and you get crashed and you get injured. You can continue to lose control and you die. We assume one of those three things happens. But there's no way to determine that all three don't happen. And that for the you that died, then timelines stop. But for the you who lost control and didn't die, that timeline goes on. But also, the you that got control back, that timeline goes on. And Professor Ford is raising that question for us. He also is raising that question of reality that I mentioned way back with Plato. Where are these events occurring? If they're occurring at all. Does Ardnith and his crew sail to Pansalopia? Or is Pansalopia just a figment? Maybe, you notice that the shaman appears at the end of the story. Ardnith rubs his eyes and opens them to see the shaman cradling the dream child in his arms. The sly old man spins like a woman dancing and steps away into the night. One of the things that shamans did to create their mystical vision was eat things like the magic mushrooms. All of this may have been a vision created by the shaman using Ardith. He gave Ardith some mushrooms and programmed a little bit, and all of this went on in Ardith's head. Or all of this is going on outside of space and time. All of this is in the mind of Vashmina. Nothing really exists except Vashmina. Or nothing exists except the shaman. Was there ever really a trip? If we drug you and program you a hallucination that you went to Red Bank, did you go or didn't you? Well, you won't know. You won't know for sure whether that was a hallucination or not unless somebody tells you from outside that it was. So we never get a perspective that we can really fix on with this. I mean, the one thing that always comes back is we always come back to Vashmina dancing. But we always go out from her to events that may or may not have happened. You have to raise some questions in your mind when you come across the lion who guards the door. And in fact, he's kind of dreaming. Notice what he says? Gum shnish. It's kind of like if somebody was nodding off and you ask a question and I say, Gum shnish. That's the way Professor Ford told me it was said in his mind. So that story really came out of that word, Gum shnish. It all evolved out from that. And it's the kind of it doesn't mean anything. He tells you it doesn't mean anything. The old beast man, Killif, laughs at their weapons and steps aside. Shnish, he says. His only word, which means nothing. And of course he says it again later in the story, where we have another one of those time things. Ardith's wife is weeping because she had a nightmare that he was going to die. He asked her what it is. Gum shnish, says the loyal Killif, sometime 8 years hence. And the widow soon-to-be says less. Ardith draws his blade as the first hungry blossom descends to devour him. All of a sudden he's back where the flowers, the man-eating flowers are about to eat him. We don't know that he drowns. There are those man-eating flowers that come towards him. He does cut one of them off, but we don't know if all of this isn't the death dream. Remember, at the end of the story, he has that death dream where everything is flashing before his eyes. All of this may be the death dream, and we don't know. The blossom consumes him with a maw of thorns. He got eaten by the flower. In a mirrored room, where he made love with Vashmina. At the bottom of the ocean, where he drowned. Next to his sleeping wife, where he never left. All of this may be Ardith's dream. You notice how many dreams there are going on with a story that's shaped like a dream with at least 4 dreams going on in it. The shaman's dream, Vashmina's dream, Ardith's wife's dream, which predict his death, and Ardith's dream, Ardith's death dream, as he's drowning or as he's about to be eaten, and we don't know about any of them. Reality is distorted. Time, space, all weave the way they do within the mind. So what Professor Ford does here for us then is to create a subconscious experience, a dramatization of subconscious experience. Anybody have any questions or comments on any of those stories? Okay.